Hi, I'm Joe Perez. Welcome to the virtual 2021 Scottish Summit and my session from concept to reality with actionable data. Please be sure to visit the sponsors' web pages. I'm sure they would greatly appreciate your patronage. A little bit about me. I'm a senior systems analyst at the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services and chief technology officer at Solentech Corporation. I bring more than 30 years of experience as an IT professional and another decade of experience as an educator. I trust that my session will be beneficial to you, so I look forward to speaking to you today. Thank you. On May 25th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy, in an address to the U.S. Congress, issued a challenge to the entire country when he said, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. This coming July marks the 52nd anniversary of the day America met that challenge, just 8 years after the president threw down the gauntlet. But this monumental feat could not have been accomplished without using data that was made actionable. There were innumerable logistical issues to tackle. Things like timing the launch when the relative positions of Earth and Moon were optimal, choosing a landing site that met all the right conditions, supplying the needs of the astronauts, calculating fuel consumption parameters, figuring out how to get them there, and more importantly, bring them home safely. The list just goes on and on and on. Remember, the microprocessor would not even be invented until 1971. So the technology needed to conquer all these insurmountable obstacles simply did not exist. It's not like they could Google anything because the internet hadn't been invented yet either. They just had to make it up as they went. All of this that you see on your screen here exponentially increased the value of having actionable data during the Apollo program to give NASA the insight they needed to answer the incessant questions, make those tough decisions, and ultimately meet JFK's challenge. Well, actually, they exceeded it. Techopedia defines actionable insight as information that can be acted upon or information that gives enough insight into the future that the actions that should be taken become clear for decision makers. In other words, meaningful data that's useful for making a decision, answering a question, or solving a problem. Remember those three characteristics of actionable data because you will see them again. It distinguishes data that can improve things from data that serves as nothing more than fancy window dressing or interesting trivia. But in data storytelling, with every data visualization, you have to start somewhere. You have a concept or an idea in mind, and then you have as your end goal a completed visualization containing one or more graphs. Now, how do you get from concept to reality? I'd like to think of this data storytelling journey as a spectrum, along which I suggest various stages, specifically 5, for best practices in getting from the idea on the left to the completed visualization on the right. These 5 stages are conception, inception, perception, inspection, and direction. Now, the way I've laid these stages out from left to right across the screen here, you might assume that I intend for them to occur one after the other. Well, maybe so, but they can also be concurrent and even overlapping. In any case, we need to look at these in the light of a strategy that's comprehensive and with a positive mindset. You see, this is supposed to be an enjoyable thing to do, not a drudgery. And don't forget, before your concept becomes reality, it needs to be visualized and it must stand up to scrutiny. I'll give you more detail on that in just a few moments. All right, let's jump right in. First stage, Conception. You have to start the race somewhere. How do we go about doing that? Well, I see the key word as articulate. As you articulate the need, it's important to understand your audience. Those are the people who are going to be consuming your data. Visualization Senior Director Tricia Onderud recently said, your audience determines the depth of your data communication and the presentation method. Hey, you've got to know your audience. That makes perfect sense to me. You wouldn't articulate the need to a room full of project managers in the same way you would to a group of business intelligence specialists or to DBAs and programmers in the same way you would to, say, a bunch of university faculty members or anybody else for that matter. You must also know your data. That's a given because you need to be able to articulate what you want to do with the data. And doing so is where your concept or idea is conceived. The most important thing to be articulated is the purpose for your data. What are you trying to show? Are you showing comparison, distribution, composition, or relationship? Well, the answer to that determines the type of visualization that would be the most appropriate for the story you're telling with your data. And that, in turn, will lead to even more questions that guide you to refine your approach along the way. Think of it as a hierarchy. Dr. Andrew Abella, chairman of the Department of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., all-round visualization expert, has come up with an amazing graphics tool that I believe masterfully articulates the need and sets the pace with these 4 categories that he's identified for data storytelling. All right, as the slide builds out, let's look at these 4 categories. If you're showing comparison, you should ask, am I comparing among items or over time? The key here is behavior. If you're showing distribution, the question is, among how many variables is this being distributed? Here, the key is dimension. If you're showing composition, you should ask, well, does it change over time or is it static over time? The key here is structure. And finally, if you're showing relationship, the question becomes, how many variables are being related? With the key being class. And by class, I mean, what type of relationship do these variables have to each other? Is it linear, inverse, or is it direct squared? Okay, here is a closer look at Abella's chart chooser cheat sheet. Bit of a tongue twister, right? All right, you see the 4 categories radiating out from the center and the questions coming off of that, and then the sub questions, and then the right graph at the very end, okay? So composition is the example here, right? We start asking questions. Does it change over time or is it static over time? And if it changes over time, are you talking about many time periods or few time periods? And if there are many periods, well, then are the differences relative or are they relative and absolute? So you see how certain questions lead to other questions as you proceed along the decision tree here. And that helps you, again, to refine your approach and come up with the right graph. Well, at least the ones that are considered to be the best practice. That's the stage of conception. Second stage, inception. Once the race has been started, well, here's where we need to make the case. Keyword, advocate. Make the case for expressing the concept visually. Folks, this is very powerful for a couple of reasons, according to Mike Parkinson, founder of Billion Dollar Graphics. He says we're affected in 2 ways, cognitively and emotionally. First of all, cognitively. Graphics speed up the way we communicate and help us to better understand and more clearly remember what we've learned. They're like visual clues that we can use to unlock a deeper meaning and focus our attention, so it's more likely we'll remember what we've seen. Secondly, we're affected emotionally. Graphics also improve our mindset and affect our feelings. They connect with our creativity by stimulating different parts of the brain, leading us to more fully understand what's being presented. Do you realize what Parkinson is saying here? We're affected both cognitively and emotionally. In other words, graphics get a hold of both our brains and our hearts. Hey, what better marriage could you possibly want? I mean, anytime that you're able to touch both the brain and the heart, man, oh man, you've got something good going. British David journalist David McCandless said in a 2010 TED Talk that sight, by far, has the highest bandwidth of any of the five senses. About 80% of the information we take in is by eye, he said. Additional research in the years since then shows that to be more like 90%. To that point, it's important to pay attention to visual cues. Have you ever seen those paragraphs with scrambled words that seem to pop up on social media every once in a while? Why do we seem to be able to read them so easily when, I don't know, they look like Gaelic or something? All right, here's an example. Let's see how quickly you can pick this up as I read it. Okay, watch your screen. You ready? Let's go. According to research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be at the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without problems. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. Man, that should give you a headache, huh? Now, why is it that you can read this? Yeah, for that matter, what's true about what I read to you and what's just plain bunk? Well, to start off with, Cambridge University never conducted such a study. I mean, maybe it sounds like something they might do, but nah, there's no record of it. But it is true, though. The human brain does indeed process words as a whole rather than one letter at a time. However, you need contextual inference. That is, they should be rather small words and arranged in such a way that we can use our experience so the brain can fill in the gaps. We're pretty good at that. We'll see the same principle on the visual level with an optical illusion in just a few minutes. Also, it helps when basic sounds are preserved. For instance, you can more easily guess that TOATL stands for total, TOTAL, than you could if it had been spelled TALOT instead, right? Lastly, it's easier when you can predict what's coming next. Again, the human brain from previous experience is best at filling in the context from incomplete information when it can anticipate what's coming up next. You know what they coined a term for this sort of thing? You ready? It's called typoglycemia. You gotta love it. All right, look, this principle also applies with data storytelling. Okay. Just as words are perceived as pieces of a message, so also images are perceived as parts of a story. Hey, so McCandless really hit the nail on the head with this thing, didn't he? A couple of European research professors, Emery Sawyer and Robin Hogarth, teamed up on a study in which three groups of economists were asked the same question regarding a particular data set. The results of this study seem to support McCandless's TED Talk claim. One group was given the data and a standard statistical analysis of the data. Now remember, they only had one job, okay? Just one question to answer. 72% of those economists could not get the answer right. Can you believe it? A second group was given the data, a statistical analysis, and a graph. Now, y'all think they did better than the second group? Yeah, good. I see you nodding your heads. No, 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 no. I cannot see you nodding your heads. All right. Well, yeah, you're right. If you said yes, they did better. They did, but not by much. Still, 61% of those economists couldn't pull it off. Again, they only had one question to answer. A third group was given only the graph. All right. Nothing. No data, no analysis, nothing else. Just the graph. And only 3% of them got the answer wrong. You know, This certainly makes the case for visual representation of data, and it's something that we can advocate. That's the stage of inception. So far, you learned to start the race and to make your case. Now, motivate the base. Keyword here, educate. Hey, folks, we're not going to get very far in this data storytelling process if either the target audience or your stakeholders are not on board. So it's up to us to educate them, making them realize that they've got some skin in this game. See, they can't take ownership or provide the necessary backing, financially or otherwise, if they don't understand what you're trying to present, or if they can't see what's in it for them, or if the visualization doesn't help them to make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. Hey, I told you you'd see those again. Well, how do I go about doing that? By understanding some basic principles. And you know what? That's foundational to any educational initiative, isn't it? For instance, you ever heard anybody say, he's all talk and no action? Or she's all fluff and no substance? Or this project is just form without function? So it begs the question, does form follow function? I'd have to say yes. It's the age-old argument, right? Is it pretty or is it right? Does it look good or does it work? Okay. Now, this business about form following function leads to another question. What do we mean by form and function? Well, function is what you do with the data, whereas form is how to express functional outcomes in the best possible way. Here's some best practice or cardinal rules that we need to keep in mind to ensure that function always gets the right priority over form in our data storytelling. Yeah, it ought to look pretty, but it's more important that it be right. Let me show you some examples of what not to do and how to deal with it. First of all, pie charts. Oh boy, you gotta love them or hate them. There's typically no middle ground with these guys, right? Some people think they're the best thing since sliced bread, while others say they're the spawn of the devil himself. Regardless of how you might feel about pie charts. Suppose your mom baked you a small pie when you were a kid and said you could have it all. Maybe not all of it at one time, so she cuts it into 4 slices. Now, how many of those 4 slices would you end up eating if you were to have consumed a whole pie? I'd hope you guys would say 4. Very good. Yes, smart. Yeah. Now, I'm not trying to insult anybody's intelligence here. I'm simply making a point. It should be easy for everybody to understand that pie charts are supposed to show the parts of a whole. Everybody ought to know that. You'd think, but some people just don't get it. Let me show you what I mean. Take a look at the pie chart shown in the fuzzy screenshot from this TV newscast. I see a couple of problems with this chart right off the bat. First of all, look at the numbers. If you add them up, you get 193. Hey, how can you have 193% of a single pie? Well, that's almost like 2 pies, isn't it? Secondly, check out the sizes of each slice. 70 is supposed to be bigger than 60, isn't it? Yeah. Well, then how come that 60 slice looks bigger than the 70 slice? It's disproportionate, right? In reality, the survey questions used in putting this news report together allowed for multiple choices. That is, respondents were able to indicate support for more than one candidate. Aha! Now you see why the numbers add up to more than 100. Now, that in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem. The problem here is that's not the way you show things in a pie chart. We can therefore conclude that this pie chart is misleading. And in this particular case, a bar graph would have reflected the data much more accurately, don't you think? Yeah. Something like this. See, same data, but presented in a way that is not misleading. Now, if there were a way to make a pie chart in which the numbers could add up to greater than 100 and still be proportional and accurate, it would have to look like this. There's no way on this earth or any other earth that you're going to get Excel to make something that looks like that. Not going to happen. So what about line graphs and bar charts? Well, another best practice is that the y-axis should have a consistent scale. Look at the sample line chart showing the number of people aged 25 and older as a percent of total graduate business enrollment has changed over time. Now, upon first glance, you might assume that there was a huge spike between 1973 and 1974. You see that? But look more closely at the odd way in which the vertical axis is scaled from 28 to 33%, thus making the change between those 2 years appear to be fairly drastic. See how steep that line is? I'd call this chart maybe a little bit misleading, wouldn't you? By contrast, look at the chart on the right. It doesn't matter that it's a bar graph and not a line chart. Okay, it shows the same thing. Here's the point. It's the same data, but with the y-axis scaled to start from 0. And you can see perhaps a more realistic depiction of that enrollment trend over that same 5-year period of time. I'd say the second chart is not misleading. You notice I didn't call that second chart corrected necessarily. You see, many organizations, people, institutions, whatever, they're going to purposefully represent their graphics in a particular way, however they want to, without any regards whatsoever for statistical norms or accuracy or anything else. All they care about is making it look good, no matter what the data says. Or we want it to say what the boss wants it to say. In fact, specific misrepresentation of data occurs in many cases for self-serving purposes. Manipulating the data to make it say what they want to say instead of allowing the data to speak for itself. Personally, I think we should hold ourselves to a much higher standard of accuracy and integrity. Now, that said, it doesn't necessarily mean that the y-axis should always be forced to start from 0 in every single case, every single time. Sometimes when you're comparing multiple data sets with multiple series in which the whole bunch of numbers are really close together, well, the only way you can see a difference is to zoom in on that scale. You can't help that. All I'm suggesting is that you be consistent across the board and avoid making changes over time appear to be more drastic than they really are. So not only should the y-axis be scaled consistently, it should also be labeled properly. Check out this chart. You notice anything missing? There's no label on the y-axis. Okay, there is merit to the minimalist approach. You don't want to over-label things and get it full of chart junk. But if your vertical axis doesn't have a label at all, your chart can be misleading. And it actually is in that case. I'll show it to you. If you look in this case, you'll see how that last bar on the right, the yellow one or orange, I don't know, whatever color that is, looks like it's maybe 4 or 5 times bigger than the first one on the left. Yeah. However, the last time I checked, 2062 is not 4 or 5 times bigger than 1371. Okay, it's not even double. Therefore, I'd call this chart misleading. Here are some other best practices that influence perception. If you're plotting something chronologically, it should go from left, the past, to right, the future, along the horizontal axis. If you're measuring quantity, plot it along the vertical, the y-axis, with the smaller numbers at the bottom and the bigger numbers at the top. Now, you say, Joe, why are you telling us this? Isn't it pretty obvious? Well, yes, but I've noticed in recent years a trend that seems to want to reverse this practice, this upside down business with the little numbers at the top and the big numbers at the bottom, getting all fancy schmancy. I've got to admit, it looks pretty cool, but it's still confusing. And then be consistent when you're using colors, remembering that there are universal constants. Like red means stop, danger, decline, whereas green means go, safety, growth. Everybody knows that. Okay, these days, we're encouraged to adopt a more muted palette due to concerns over accessibility, that kind of thing. But the principle's still the same thing. Spencer Sobczak tells us that contrasting colors differentiate between groups, whereas different shades of the same color can communicate the relative strength or weakness of a value. And then keep your shaped graphical elements proportional to each other. Master statistician and Yale professor Edward Tufte advocates not exceeding what he calls the lie factor. Essentially, it says that the representation of numbers as physically measured on the surface of the graphic itself should be directly proportional to the quantities they represent. As a mathematical equation, it's often expressed like this: the size of the effect shown in the graphic divided by the size of the effect shown in the data should never be greater than 1. And let me illustrate. In one of their iterative product releases for a new iPad model several years ago, Apple touted its greater battery capacity over its predecessor. Rightfully so. A 17% increase is pretty significant. But look at this graph, though. The battery icon on the right, representing the capacity of the new iPad, looks like it's maybe 3 or 4 times bigger than the one on the left, representing the predecessor. That is certainly way more than 17%. And as much as I like my iPad, that, my friends, is a misleading graph. Finally, always use the right tool for the right job. You wouldn't use a chainsaw to carve a turkey, would you? How about a sledgehammer to crack a walnut? Of course not. All right, look, the same principle applies with visualizations. Remember Abella's chart chooser. Take pie charts. I mean, they're great, unless you're one of those that think they're the spawn of the devil. I mean, they are great as long as they're used in the way they're intended and designed to be used. But 2 of them, side by side, not so much. Now, in all fairness, the 2 pie charts you see here are 100% accurate. There's nothing misleading or deceptive going on here. However, you have to go back to the make the case, the inception stage, and ask, what are you trying to show? Can you do any of the 3 things I talked about? Remember the 3 characteristics of actionable data. Can you make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem with it? Each chart by itself is trying to show how these 5 countries compare among themselves and to what extent they contribute to the whole. The 2 pie charts together show how that overall makeup changed from one point in time on the left to the next point in time on the right. Now, for the sake of the argument, it doesn't matter what time frame is being compared in each pie, nor what the parts of the whole represent. Here's the problem. The human eye, together with the human brain, simply does not have the spatial acuity to perceive minute variances across multiple dimensions at the same time. Huh? All right, in simple terms, for those who would use a chainsaw to carve a turkey,
it's pretty hard for us to see them differences in these slices when they're side by side like that.
Yeah, precisely. So while the pie charts themselves are accurate, they are not actionable because we're not able to do any of those 3 things I talked about. Remember the 3 characteristics of actionable data, right? It should help you to make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. So why can't we do this? Because we can't tell just by looking at it. Did you hear what I just said? Isn't that the whole idea behind a visualization? The visual, you can't even spell visualization without spelling visual. If you can't tell just by looking at it, then it's not actionable. If somebody has to explain it to you, it's not actionable. If you can't figure out what's going on, it's just plain flat out not actionable. Now, what if we express the same data as side by side bar graphs? Watch what happens. Boom. You can clearly see the trend they were trying to show. Just like that. The order of the countries from 1 to 5 was completely reversed in the second time period. Now, you see how easy that is? Remember earlier when we asked the question, does form follow function with a yes? Now we ask the question, does conclusion follow assumptions? You know what? I'd have to say no, at least not always. I mean, that's because folks don't always see things in the same way. Let's take a closer look. Here's a classic. What do you see in this picture? Well, if we were in a live audience, I believe some of you would shout out, "Oh, I know, it's a young lady." Others would say, "Oh, I know, it's an old lady." You know what? I see an old lady here, and I see a young lady. See, the young lady is facing away from the camera. Okay, let me use my mouse as a like a laser pointer here. I don't have one. We're not live. All right, you see her little nose here and her left eyelash, and you go over to the right and you see this is her left ear, and this whole thing is her chin and her jawline, and she's wearing a little black necklace facing away from the camera. I also see an old lady, and the old lady is facing towards the camera. Again, let's look. This here's her right eyelash. This whole thing is her left eye. This thing here's her nose, her nostril. She's got a bump on her nose or something. Here's her mouth and her pointy chin jutting off to the left. So some of you said it was a young lady. Some of you said it was an old lady. Who's right? You're both right. It's all a matter of perception. Let me ask you this. How would you describe an elephant to somebody who's never seen one? Can you walk into a room? Imagine walking into a room, blindfolding, telling what you're seeing. You're going to come out of there saying, it's a spear, it's a fan, it's a wall, it's a rope, it's a tree, it's a snake, right? Look, different people perceive things in different ways. And for effective data storytelling, we must capitalize on that because a picture is worth 1,000 words. Quick review. Up to this point, you've started the race, you've made your case, and you've motivated the base. Now, you give it some space. With the fourth stage of the spectrum by asking the question, does it stand up to scrutiny? This is inspection, with the key word being investigate. Hey, folks, being totally transparent helps you to avoid the pitfalls of bias and unethical use of your data when it's being inspected. And when you've done your due diligence, you're not going to cringe when you get these questions. You know the ones I'm talking about, your favorite questions. Did you ensure data quality? Where did you get your data? How do you know it's right? You won't be bothered by them, right? They won't intimidate you. Now, here's a trend that seems a little counterintuitive. The more complex your data model is, the less likely your people will be to embrace it. To that point, suppose you wanted to buy a blender for your grandmother, and the only two choices you had are the ones on this screen. Which one do you think would be the better choice? Enough said. In a 2017 blog post, Matt Rainey, founder and director of a European search firm specializing in big data, advocated the importance of transparency in data and suggested 3 aspects of transparency. First of all, it starts with a story. Hey, what better way to make sense of an unintelligible mass of numbers than to put them into a story? Again, that's the whole point of a visualization, right? We learn best by seeing things in stories. As I said earlier in the presentation, understanding their data helps people to take ownership. And by extension, it facilitates their ability to explain it or justify it to whomever needs to know. Secondly, it involves showing the data for what it is. Warts, blemishes, wrinkles, and all. No manipulation. You see, correct, honest decisions and correct conclusions can only come from correct, unadulterated, unmanipulated data. Lastly, Rainey says that transparency is all about trust. I mean, aren't you more inclined to believe what you can trust, right? I love the way Rainey put it. Look at this. When the business learns to trust the numbers, They have a solid foundation for making the best decisions and subsequent growth. Having taken transparency into consideration, as you let the data behind your data visualization project stand up to inspection, it's important to be aware of the difference between impact and influence and how that plays into making data actionable. Wait a minute. I thought impact and influence were the same thing. Well, I see a difference between them. You see, impact is typically recognized as an effect brought on by outside forces that tend to push on your status quo. In a recent Harvard Business Review study, it was found that almost 85% of a company's performance depends upon outside factors. And what's funny about it is that many of those same companies don't even have a clue about figuring out which of those outside forces are affecting their performance and how. Instead, those who make it a priority to identify those factors are pushed into acting upon them. That's impact. By contrast, influence is generally known to be the power to affect from internal forces that tend to pull on your status quo. You see the difference? Impact is external, tends to push. Influence is internal and tends to pull. These are factors that your own organization can control. I'm talking about things like the way your data is organized and structured, when and how you're going to pull the data into your data warehouse, and the general climate in your organizational culture. You see, doing this will pull your strategy in the right direction from the inside. Let's put it bluntly, as I alluded to near the beginning of this presentation, your idea must be visualized, then scrutinized before it can be realized. In other words, if you've given it some space and it can stand up to inspection, you are well on your way to making your concept a reality with actionable data. That said, I believe that we can measure success in this area by capitalizing on this knowledge and turning ideas into reality by blending impact with influence, leveraging them both into a solid game plan to meet short-term needs and provide long-term benefit. And why is that? Well, look at the chart as it builds on the right side of your screen here, because by this time you will have learned to take your data, differentiate it to come up with information, see the connections to derive knowledge, determine the meaningful connections to grant insight, find the best paths between them for wisdom, and boom. At that point, you have impact, and you will most certainly generate influence. After having started the race, making the case, motivating the base, and giving it some space, we now come to the fifth and final stage of the spectrum, direction. It's time to put it into place. Keyword here is effectuate. I see this implementation cycle as a fourfold iterative process. You start off by deploying your solution using whatever organizational protocols and methodologies you have in place. As your stakeholders start using the solution, they'll discover issues. Believe you me, they will discover issues, okay? They may call them issues, they may call them defects, they may call them problems, but mark my words, they will discover issues. You then analyze those issues and discern the right course of action to address them. Then you start developing the remediation for those issues, and guess what? The cycle starts all over again. Deploy, discover, discern, and develop. And hopefully you'll improve upon your solution with each iterative cycle. Now, that, my friends, is an effective direction because it leads to progress. In conclusion, you ask, can I really turn my ideas into reality? You bet your boots you can. While developing your solution and moving it along these stages of the spectrum, try to ensure best practices are followed. American mathematician John Tukey once said, the greatest value of a picture is when it forces us to notice what we never expected to see. What value do you see in your data? And what ideas do you have when you see it? To stimulate these ideas, remember, graphs and data visualizations are only as good as the data they portray. They should never be any more complex than the data they portray, and they should never paint a distorted picture of the values they portray. Don't forget Tufte's lie factor, and never let the size of the effect shown in the graphic be greater than the size of the effect shown in the data. One last review and summary. Here are the 5 stages of the spectrum one last time. First stage, conception, start the race. Second stage, inception, make the case. Third stage, perception, motivate the base. Fourth stage, inspection, give it some space. Fifth stage, direction, put it into place. Enterprise account executive and expert data storyteller Spencer Sobczak once said, data storytelling is both an art and a science. Our data visualizations are the most powerful when they find this balance. Hey, folks, I'm totally convinced that if you articulate, advocate, educate, and investigate your data, you should be able to effectuate a solution. Ladies and gentlemen, with actionable data, NASA exceeded President Kennedy's monumental challenge more than 50 years ago and not only sent astronauts to the moon successfully, but also returned them to the Earth safely. And what's more, they repeated it 5 more times over the next 3 years. Remember, they could not have done it without actionable data. So, what is actionable data? Remember, data is actionable only when it helps people to do what 3 things? Make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. Hey, what can you do with actionable data? Well, you may not be putting a man on the moon, but you can certainly put the heat on your competition. If you have enough vision and drive, you can figure out how to get from today to tomorrow before it becomes yesterday and you're left behind holding the bag. Nobody wants that. I'll leave you with some parting advice with my own personal limerick from my friend named Bob. There once was a man named Bob whose boss was a bit of a slob. He made a nice graph, but didn't do the math. So he found himself out of a job. What's the advice here? Hey, don't be like Bob. Turn your ideas into reality by making data actionable. Thanks so much for watching.